Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Nick, and I help direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's event with Rian Hughes and Grant Morrison, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass-Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are excited to have with us Rian Hughes, a graphic designer, illustrator, comic artist, and typographer who has worked extensively for the British and American advertising, music, and comic book industries. He has written and drawn comics for 2000 AD and Batman Black and White, and designed logos for the Avengers, the X-Men, Superman, record label Head Candy, MTV, and James Bond. He has edited books on mid-century lifestyle illustration and custom typography, and written on semiotics, culture, and collecting vintage science fiction pulps and paperbacks. In 2020, he was nominated for an Eisner Award for his book Logo A Go-Go. Joining Rian in conversation is prolific comic writer Grant Morrison. Grant has been working with DC Comics for more than 20 years, beginning with his legendary runs on the revolutionary titles Animal Man and Doom Patrol. In his secret identity, Morrison is a counterculture spokesperson, a musician, an award-winning playwright, and a chaos magician. He is also the author of the New York Times bestseller Super Gods, a groundbreaking psychohistoric mapping of the superhero as a cultural organism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rian and Grant to the stage.
Yeah.
Hey Grant.
Hey, how you doing?
Very well. Up late.
Up late, yeah, it's terrible. I mean, we're just old men now. It's too late for me. I get up with the sun and then I go to bed with the sun. I'm moved with the whim of the winds and the tides because I'm living in the country. So this feels late.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for staying up. I know, what is it? I think it's 6 o'clock in New York. So So
have you been to the Strand bookstore, Brian?
I have. The first time I was in New York, which I think was 2001, something like that.
Yeah.
It was prior to 9/11 because I remember I went before and after, with about sort of 3 years between. But I do remember spending sort of a whole afternoon in there, sort of going through their graphic design books, nerding out on their 50s type catalogues.
Yeah, it's a pretty good store. I used to love going there. So how's things been since the book's been out for a little while now in Britain, and now it's out in America? So how's it been since the launch?
Well, like I said before, the response to it has been phenomenal. I mean, I was sort of expecting incomprehension when this hit the book stands. You know, this big fat epic indulgent piece of experimental typography that possibly people would balk at, but everyone's been
because it's a good story as well. I mean, fortunately it's a very good story as well, so you know everything else about it at least is on the spine and on the basis of something that reads really well. You know, it's like a thriller. It's a good sci-fi thriller as well as everything else, I think.
Well, that was what SFX said, which I thought was I was very thankful for, that it sort of read like a thriller. And I thought if I was going to do something that was a bit experimental and asked quite a lot of the audience, that I would have to have some thread of a story that pulled you through. So there were sort of characters and events where you would want to find out what happened next. It's a bit like, if you're going to produce a pretty experimental piece of music, you want a good tune so that it's listenable, so that you can sneak the more experimental, weird stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and with that in mind, you know, the fact that it has big set pieces, it has characters, it has these fantastic scenes, And I thought, if it was to be translated to something, amazing 12-part television special, could you imagine a way in which the typographical elements of it could be transferred to another medium? Because the story clearly could. I thought, when I was looking at it again, it's a story that's, it's got great beginning, middle, and end. It's all there. But I wondered if it were to be moved, is there a way of creating those typographic effects in a different medium?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think that what you'd need to do is find analogues so that, for example, the Ascension story, which is, for those people who haven't read it yet, is typeset to look like an old pulp magazine. So you get an 8-part story within the main book that's set, typeset like an old issue of, say, fantasy and science fiction or something like that. Is that if you were doing, say, a TV show, what you would do is you'd have a sort of 5-minute segment that was in black and white and looked like an old episode of The Outer Limits or something like that. Mm-hmm. So you would use analogues in order to create the same effect. But because in the novel the characters wear these glasses and the typography is actually in the 3-dimensional space that they're in as a sort of augmented reality, I would love to see that on screen. Basically to have sort of lettering and shapes moving around in the same space as our characters,
Yeah, it's like
around.
I mean, you directed me to some of those moving topography things back, a few years ago. I remember you showing some of those things online, where they were actually, things that were put to songs or moved to beats where the topography would change and bounce. So I think it'd be interesting to see something like that being done with it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I mean, going back to the original thing, when, as I said before, when you talked about me, the cat's up here and the cat wants to join in. When you talked to me about this way back, and it was the red square idea and XX, it was a different kind of thing. You planned it almost as a comic book at the time or a graphic novel, but there was this moment of when did you decide to make the novel graphic and change, your focus from where it originally begun and into something that was much more traditional in the sense of it's a book with words, even though those words are very active and alive.
Yeah, originally I did sort of envisage it as being more like a comic, but I think part of it is that I kind of fell out of love with drawing comics a bit, and I couldn't really build up enough enthusiasm for doing a comic of the length that I would need to do in order to get through this entire narrative. I mean, it's a very long narrative. I didn't know how long it was going to be when I started. I didn't intend it to be 900 plus pages. But also what I wanted to do is sort of broaden it out. And even if it was going to be a comic, I sort of envisaged having bits that were just typographic or just page illustrations or maybe snippets of magazines or other graphic design ephemera thrown in. And what happened is that the graphic design ephemera and the typographic elements kind of expanded, and the idea that there would be bits of it that would be told in comics shrunk until there were no comics. There are illustrative elements in it. But I think that I'm sort of blocking out another story at the moment that probably will have comic interludes or narrative drawing in it. Yeah. It might be that I have text and then I have images, and the images have no text, so there's no speech balloons or captions, and I switch between a purely written and a purely visual way of storytelling, and have two characters, one of whose exploits or actions you see entirely in a visual way, and then someone else who you read about entirely in a written way, and see if I can interplay the two of them. So
I mean, because there seems to be a lot of potential experimental area in this idea of the novel graphic, which hasn't really been dealt with before. Just by flipping the notion around a little bit. I think what you say there seems to be a lot of territory to explore. The image and the word and the typographic elements could Yeah, you go.
No, there's a massive history of sort of expressive typography, right back to sort of concrete poetry, the futurists, the Dadaists, those kind of collages of.
Including comic art stuff, or including pop culture, the collages of the Dadaist collages, which would use newspaper cutouts and images. And I used to love collage work. Like punk was the same. There's so much collage work, like those Buzzcocks singles and things.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely something in that. I used to like making collage. I feel as if there's definitely an area there, as you say, where there's a lot more to be done.
Well, I think that comics is a sort of subset of this thing called just words and pictures, and words and pictures is this expansive area that sort of comic books has sort of occupied a very creative but confined place within, and the comic strips. I mean, you do this a lot in your work. You sort of if you can become aware of the form and then play with the form and then show how the form might operate in different ways, I always think that's an interesting creative aspect of doing it. You're sort of breaking the fourth wall and telling people how you're constructing the story while you're telling them the story. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I do like, I mean, I think as a graphic designer, it's one of the things you're always doing is you're aware of the content, but the form of the content at the same time and how the two interrelate. But talking about the sort of the Buzzcocks, that was good old Malcolm Garrett, one of my all-time designers, yeah. And I remember coming out of school, and opposite my school was Beggar's Banquet, the famous record shop, and they had. I think it was the cover of A Different Kind of Tension. Was that the first or second Buzzcocks album?
First one, I think.
Yeah, in the window, and it was an early Malcolm Garrett sleeve, and I didn't have enough money to buy the album, and I taped it off a friend of mine. But what happened was that the person who ran the shop kept the sleeves for me, the empty cardboard sleeves that they'd used in the window display. So somewhere in a box in the loft here, I have like the album, an empty cardboard sleeve. So and those sort of early punk flyers. I mean, I do reference this. If Nick, are you there? Can you bring up a slide or two? If you bring up slide 33, you can sort of see how I sort of reference those. Sort of
sure thing. Give me 1 second.
Okay. We have technical support here with us. That's courtesy of Strand, who are going to show us the odd
slide 23. I noticed someone just mentioned Burroughs and suddenly we bring up slide 23.
Slide 33. I beg your pardon.
Oh, the 33. Hold on, ruined it.
But I mean, in your work as well, you're always sort of playing with language, and no, that's not the right page. That's 25. 33. Okay, don't worry.
Apologies. I thought you meant page 33. Sorry about that.
Page 33 in the PDF. The numbers in the top right-hand corner might not confirm.
Yeah,
we're consummate professionals here.
This is great. You could read the entire book here.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't see the slide number. I can only see the page number.
Okay, you've got to. Well, you're gonna have to scroll on a few more.
Just work through it, and we'll find it eventually. I'm sure.
Yeah, there you go. Stop.
There we go. That was it.
So that's my sort of tribute to the kind of sniffing glue punk flyer.
That just totally reminds me of my punk fanzine days and doing Bombs Away Batman and cutting out all these different things from newspapers and magazines. It's brilliant.
Well, what I did was I got out my letter set, which I've still got in the drawer somewhere here, and I was trying to rub down letters from this letter set, and it had kind of become one with the backing sheet, so it wouldn't actually rub down, and so you got bits of letters. But then I just kind of ran with it because it actually looked pretty punky. So the limitations of the medium were to our benefit here. But what I do is I go through sort of various sort of different graphic conceits. So, Nick, if we can go back to, say, page 9 on the PDF. Forward. Okay, let's go back one. Actually, we'll stop there. Well, as part of the conceit of the book, there is a signal from space that has been picked up by Jodrell Band, and this is a digital signal, but no one actually knows what it is. And then it gets leaked. And I wrote this music review as if someone had taken this signal from space and then turned it into an album. And so this is me on the left, sort of writing in my best sort of enemy, pretentious music journalist form. So it's full of phrases like sonic cathedrals of sound and, that kind of stuff. And then I commissioned DJ Food and my sister, who's a sort of classical pianist, to actually make the album. So on the right-hand side, you see the album cover, and then we put a QR code in the book. So if you point your camera at that QR code, it takes you to Bandcamp, and you can listen to the album. So the album came after the review, which I thought was a first. And I was talking, I think DJ Food tells me that actually there was a review back in the 60s that people thought was the Beatles and the Stones sort of, I'm probably going to tell this completely wrong, but it was a bunch of very well-known musicians, and the rumor was that this album was them without the permission of their record labels sort of getting together and producing an album, which it wasn't. But then they actually went and got a bunch of session musicians together to try and to make this album. I've never heard it. Apparently it's not very good. But yeah, so there's nothing new under the sun. But anyway, the idea here was that it's a sort of multimedia experience. So you can, when you get to this point in the book, you can then listen to the album that was created from this alien signal.
And where did you derive the signal? Was it, did you create one? Did you make it? Or did you base it on something?
Well, it's hard to see on the right here because it's quite small. Yeah. But the cover, that's the cover of the album, and it's a sort of 0-1 binary code that covers it. But I thought I can't have just a random series of noughts and ones because somebody somewhere can read binary. You never underestimate your readers. And so what it is, it's actually the first couple of pages of the Ascension story rendered into binary. Oh, right. And it took a matter of days when the book came out for someone to tweet that they had deciphered this. It was literally 2 or 3 days after it was launched in the UK before someone figured this out.
It's wonderful to have such attentive readers.
Yeah. Well, they tripped
annotators will be hard at work in the book.
Yeah.
So speaking of Ascension, I know you did so much research in the book, but particularly into the pulps, where you went through this obsessive phase of collecting the pulps and coming home with bags and bags filled with old sci-fi digests and paperbacks. So was the Ascension idea there before that? Was that to power were you trying to basically absorb all that so that you could create something in that mode? Or were you just buying them because you're obsessed with sci-fi books?
Well, I am buying them because I'm obsessed with them. But I came across this. I was on my way to one of these comic get-togethers in London, and I happened to go past this bookstore, which sadly is closed down as part of the lockdown. It's no longer there, and I saw in the window they had some amazing stories pulps from the 20s, and I went in, and some collector had divested themselves of their entire life's collection. It was the mother load. I just could not believe how much stuff there was there. And I was going through it all, and the guy behind the counter said, "Oh, we've got even more downstairs." So I went downstairs, and there was literally sort of pretty much every science fiction pulp from about 1925 up until about 1970 by title in order for about £2 to £3 each, and I bought hundreds and hundreds of pounds worth of them. I bought bags and bags of this. I was actually due. This is the story. I was actually due to be at Forbidden Planet at a signing, and I barely made it. And I turned up with these massive carrier bags. Yeah, so the kind of aesthetic of that sort of pulp writing was the idea behind Ascension, and so you get this 8-part story, as I said, sort of interspersed into the main narrative, and it happens in the novel between the point at which you lose contact with one of the characters. There's a few spoilers here for those who haven't read it, but one of the characters is on the far side of the moon and has an encounter with something or other, and we don't know what's happened to her. And then we get this 8-part story, and at the end of which we then sort of pick up with her again. So it sort of occupies the space in the story where it almost is a kind of metaphor or analog for maybe what's happening to her and what's going on in her mind. And the kind of conceit of this story was that it was published by this unknown pulp author called Herschel Teague, who then goes on to sort of create a kind of Scientology style self-improvement cult and slowly goes mad. And as part of the background to this, if we can go to slide 18 on the PDF, I don't know what page number that is, please, Nick.
Which page is that?
Page 18.
Okay.
I can't see the page numbers in the top right-hand corner because they're too small. So the numbers in the top right-hand corner don't coincide with the actual page. So keep going.
Just let me know.
Yeah. So this is Ascension. So if we go back one, so it has a map because every sort of epic fantasy story has to have a map. You know, Dune has a map. Tolkien has a map.
Lord of the Rings has a map. Earthsea has a map. Everyone has a map. Conan has a map. Game of Thrones has a map.
So this is, if we scroll on now, next slide, please, Nick. What I did was I created this kind of fake history for this Ascension short story. So these are all the books, starting from the first pulp publication, sort of right up to the present day. So like the works of, say, Philip Dick have been sort of reassessed, and whereas they were all written for the pulps originally, now they're probably part of, say, the Penguin Classics. I mean, Lovecraft's stories are now all part of the Penguin Classics series and have been designed in the kind of Penguin Classics style. So if we go on through the next 1, 2, 3, 4 slides, this is like the history. You shot through those very fast. If we can go back a bit, just take our time. So this is the kind of history, sort of going through the 50s and 60s of this fictional story by Herschel Teague and all the different sort of paperback versions of it, sort of up through the 50s, 60s, and then sort of into the 70s. So again, it's this kind of deep history and sort of playing with the kind of different graphic design tropes that book covers would be done in through the decades.
But also, what interests me about that story, Ryan, is it's a good enough story in its own to justify this kind of reprinting. I mean, it's a really beautifully created alien culture, which is totally alien. It's non-human, but the events that happen, I mean, they're very understandable. It's very relatable, but the character is not human. When you describe the world and the characters, it's like nothing we would recognize. And I think it has that quality of it. It doesn't feel pulpish in the sense it's ray guns and spaceships and 1950s guys in bubble helmets. It's a really good story of an alien culture. You could see how it might be reprinted and reappraised and seen as something more than it began as, or maybe it was always intended to be as much as it was. So that's what I find interesting. You didn't just write a crappy 50s sci-fi story. You wrote this thing that really, really works on its own merits as well, I feel. And so the idea of then putting that in the book, I mean, I wonder if it's, in Watchmen, there's the pirate story, which comments on the main story. There's an element of that, but this seems even more, because this does actually almost play into the story. Like this comes back, this is in the main story too, as if maybe this happened somewhere.
Yeah. What I do is I sort of thread sort of parts of it sort of back into the main narrative in sort of interesting ways that, if I describe how it's done, will kind of spoil the end in some way. So I won't go into details. But
don't explain it.
Yeah. So it's the Black Freighter. That was the Watchman. Yeah, it's a similar kind of conceit. It's sort of a fake history, sort of a deep history of the form that you somehow comment on in order to, you use to comment on the material that's happening in the present in the novel. I would say that I happened to pick up an old Jack Vance book called Eyes of the Overworld, and it's that kind of feel. So it's probably not 50s. It's probably sort of mid 60s, before New World and all the kind of Michael Moorcock, J.G. Ballard stuff sort of kicked in a big way. There's a character in Eyes of the Overworld who is this sort of slightly arrogant aristocrat who messes things up without really knowing what he's doing. And the celestial mechanic has definitely got a bit of that in him. He comes from, the idea is that you've got a world where sort of in its early history, it was bombarded with comets or asteroids. And so there were massive craters everywhere. But as the culture that inhabits this world evolves, the craters are lakes, and so in the middle of the crater you get a spire of rock. As you do in the middle of a crater, you get that central pinnacle. And I wondered what kind of culture would exist where you have a circular sea at the center of which is this sort of elevated culture that occupies this spire, and then outside the crater walls are all the farmers and the crops and the livestock and all the rest of it. So you would get this very sort of stratified culture where on the spire, depending on how high up on the spire you were, was a direct correlation to your social position in this world. Whereas all the sort of commoners, you had to get on a boat and cross this circular sea and climb over the mountain of the crater to actually get to where all the people who were actually feeding you were. So you'd have this very sort of aristocratic society and then this very sort of working class society and the interaction between the two. And so the basics of the story are that our character, the celestial mechanic, for reasons that become apparent, has to go down across this sea and out into this world around the crater rim that is even more unknown to him than the heavens above. I mean, he's a celestial mechanic. He spends his time sort of foretelling the future by looking at the stars, but he's never actually been out there and seen how the sort of common man lives and works. So that's the kind of basis of that story. And then there are other... And
it relates to the main story in the sense also, which is one of the big things in the book, is the weaponization of ideas, let's say, and the potential danger of ideas when they maybe break into a closed culture like that, or a closed culture like our own, which can be...
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the... I mean, the classic example of that is when the Spaniards turned up in South America with crucifixes and syphilis and laid waste to the native population. And one of the things that history teaches you is that the culture that does the visiting, because it's got the ships, tends to be more advanced, and as well as bringing diseases, normally just because people... It's the story of War of the Worlds. The Martians were defeated not by guns and human ingenuity, but by germs. The kind of... it's like the T cells of of Earth sort of basically killed the Martians. So what you get is as well as a sort of biological collision, you get an ideological collision. So in the case of South America, it was the religion of Christianity and European social norms that colliding with the South American cultures. And one of the other major themes of the book is how would we deal with that if a completely alien set of ideas somehow got loose onto the internet. Are there?
And they specifically target cultural ideas. You're talking about the conquistadores, or we talk about the first fleets in Australia. But what they would actually do is specifically target the ideological underpinnings of the culture. They take down, destroy the sacred sites, destroy the sacred text, undermine them using your own, viral gods or whatever. So I think, that is obviously a big part of the book, and how that happens and how that might be resisted, or how certain ideas coalesce into almost godlike or angelic figures. As in the book, we have XX, we have the 19th count, and we have Girl 21, each representing these different kind of 100-year periods almost. But those ideas they wrap up a whole complex of notions. All of those are they like gods? Are they impregnable to the other ideas? Are they so sure of themselves that they can't be undermined? Is the 19th count always the 19th count? It can't be anything else.
Well, I kind of get into the sort of I have one of the characters sort of reflect on that how much does an idea change before it becomes a different idea? Yeah. So and as the 19th count and XX say, the best way to kill a bad idea is to have a better one. So it is this sort of ideology versus ideology. But the idea that the 19th count, who's the sort of zeitgeist of the 19th century, and XX, who's the epitome of the modern, sort of from the futurists right up through punk.
The man machine, as you call them, the
man machine, the mechanization of war, the kind of viral ideologies of communism and fascism that have sort of laid waste to the world. And what I sort of try and articulate is that quite often it's not human beings that are fighting each other, it's ideas that are fighting each other, and human beings are their proxies. So what sweeps back and forth across Europe throughout the 20th century are various different ways that human beings think they should live their lives, various political ideologies. And the people who are doing the fighting are sort of almost second order to the ideas that are occupying the cultures, if you like. So the cultures are the main. They're almost conscious in their own way. It's almost like a culture can have a personality and a consciousness, and come into collision with another culture that has a different personality and a different consciousness, just as two people might. And so the XX, the 19th count, and Girl 21 are they're kind of our personifications of certain periods in our history. And as becomes apparent in the book, they have almost been created for this very reason. So the 19th count, it turns out, has been sort of dreamt up by Horace Walpole and his sort of acquaintances in the stage, who they've come up with something along the lines of the Comte de Saint-Germain, this kind of idea of a man that somehow is more powerful than a real man because it outlives a real person. I mean, you talk about this with sort of superheroes, and the fact that you might sort of occupy sort of Superman's head for a short while, but he sort of lives on beyond the work that you do on him, and gets passed on to other people who contribute.
And yet we carry these characters on, with Superman or Batman. These things were created long before I was born. And then I find myself as this stewarding them through their horrible immortal lives, and feeding them with my life energy for a little bit. And then someone else will take over and keep doing that work, keep feeding them, even if, long after I'm dead. So, that kind of fascinates me, that the ideas can be embodied or actually depicted in that way, which again is what you talked about. The 19th count, and the way he speaks, and even the way the typeface there is it suggests decadence. It suggests something that's kind of appealing and eternal, really, to us. It's we always understand that kind of the dandy, the Baudelaire, the kind of character like that, and the same with Girl 21, so specific. A young woman being the face of the future, writing in short sentences.
Yeah, if we, Nick, can we bring up some examples of what the pages look like? So if we go to page 9, this is where you first meet XX. If we go, so here he sort of has this is me channeling every futurist manifesto. So he's talking about, I am the crossfire of the blitz, the mushroom cloud of the bomb, etc., etc. So what I've done here is use typography in order to illustrate the kind of bombast of this character as he comes through. And then, so if we scroll on a few pages, you can sort of see him. I am the modern. I am the 20th century. I am the double cross. I am the unknown unknown. I am XX. And then the sort of next character that we meet, the sort of next personification of an era, the next zeitgeist, is the 19th Count, who's an altogether more sort of refined sort of man of letters. So when he talks, it looks like an old Victorian bill poster. So you get this sort of profusion of historical wood type. And the language that he uses is very much sort of illustrative of the way that he thinks. And then if we sort of move on a bit further, we can see a bit more of the 19th Count talking here. And then the third character that we meet, I call these characters D-men, which stands for digital mimetic entities. And presumably they go back, there's an infinite number of them. I mean, we meet 3 of them in the main text, and then there are hints at the end that there's countless other characters just like this. If we go forward one more page, we finally meet Girl 21, who of course communicates in tweets. So she's not got the best grasp of grammar, as most people who tweet don't, but she's very much sort of, this is how she communicates. And when they first see her, I won't give too much away, but they kind of come up with a method whereby they can sort of look into this realm and see these non-physical characters. When they first see Girl 21, she seems to have this kind of shifting face, and they can't work out what's going on. And then our main character who we follow, who's called Jack, realizes that her face is thousands of borrowed selfies. So it's like a selfie flick book. So she doesn't have a face of her own. She's just basically every single Zoella who's posted a selfie, and she just uses this material to animate her expressions. So her skin tone flickers, her features flicker, and she's like a summation of every one of those kind of characters rolled into one. That actually would look really cool in a movie or a TV show. I'd love to see that.
You show so many other different ways of framing information though within typography. I'm thinking of the homespun samplers next to the punk posters, but all of them have a particular charge. They're not all of them D-men, or would some of them fit naturally into the others? Like the idea of a simple sampler. It really says something. It speaks about a specific experience, a specific way of thinking, in the same way that the punk poster does. So are those lesser angels? Are those?
Well, I think well, those the sampler, which if we go forward is on the page just before we get to the punk thing. So page 32, if we scroll forward, please, Nick. The idea then there was that they're having a sort of a battle in idea space, and without again giving too much away, they're sort of throwing concepts at concepts in order to try and sort of break through. And there were various sort of entities who were sort of borrowing from our history just to sort of throw things at us. And so we get this on the left, this kind of sewing sampler, this very twee sort of suburban middle class style of typography. And then on the right, you get this sort of Art Nouveau style. And then sort of course, to counteract this kind of twee sort of Bieber Art Nouveau 60s nonsense, or sort of 20s via the 60s nonsense. You know, that's when the punk comes in on the next page as a sort of rousing, the frying break bacon crackle of a needle in a dirty groove, basically, and then this all comes in. But this idea that you have sort of language and you can sort of use this in expressive ways, because there's also a part of the book where they're trying to communicate with these alien entities, these alien D-men, if you like, these alien ideas. If we go back, if we can go back to page 29, so if we go, yeah, stop there. Right. So what I was trying to do here is sort of come up with some sort of alien orthographies. So you have on the part leading up to this, you have sort of descriptions of what these aliens look like, and then I tried to come up with what the written language of these aliens might be. So on the left hand side here, you have these sort of vertical staves, a bit like sort of music, I guess, with sort of dots on. And the idea is that these aliens have sort of beards, and they tie knots in their beards, and depending on the positions of the knots, this is some kind of communication. And then on the right hand page, there's a creature that resembles, say, a dolphin, so it might sort of blow bubbles out of its whatever that is, air hole. What's that thing called on top of a dolphin? A sphincter.
The blowhole. We'll call it the blowhole, I believe. I'm sure it's got a scientific name that someone could tell us.
Yeah. So the orthography that a dolphin might use might be these vertical rows of bubbles in different sizes, perhaps. So,
and if you were to take a vow of silence, you would shave your beard on that other world.
Absolutely. In fact, yes, that's exactly what I've done. So if we
but what the other thing, because all of these make me think these have been designed to have a specific emotional effect, a specific effect on the reader, in the same way that all of those other graphics do. And it's does the design drive how we experience things, or does design emerge from our experience? You know, because I think in a lot of ways it drives how we perceive things. You know, when I read those pages in the kind of Wyndham Lewis blast kind of style, it brings a whole wealth of associations with it. And is it kind of does the design come first? Does design frame our experience, or does it emerge from our experience?
Well, as a graphic designer, I would say that we see something before we read something. If especially, maybe not so much a novel, because you're in close proximity to a novel, but if you imagine sort of in the built environment, if you see a poster or a record sleeve or a shop front or a sign, you're aware of the color and the shape, and then you might.
And the difference between someone who's trying to appear as a traditional cobbler compared to someone who's trying to appear as a very modern seller of vaping equipment. And the different design that would be chosen there, it'd be unlikely that the vaping shop would want to look like an old-fashioned pipe store. So the decisions made there to guide how you experience the product.
Yeah, well, I think that this is the essence of design and typography, is that you can imbue a message with so much more than just what the words say, and in fact you can play against what the words say. It's quite interesting to use an expressive form and then use that. It's a bit like, say, setting something in completely the wrong font. It has this it's not speaking the same language, and you can get this interesting tension going on. But also, I think that even if people aren't graphic designers or aren't sort of au fait with the manner in which you could lay out a novel in an interesting way, I think that everyone knows that they signal to other people and communicate all the time in non-written ways. The clothes that you wear, the hairstyle that you have, the tone of your voice, all of these things have content. And so you don't even need to open your mouth, and you're already communicating an enormous amount with a complete stranger you might happen to meet. Yeah. And there's this back and forth of communication going on utterly non-verbally.
And where do those specific cues come from? Sometimes I find interesting. I think, again, the book kind of dissects that a lot. It's like Cuban heeled boots, for instance, Chelsea boots. Well, the Beatles wore those, but the Beatles only wore those because they wanted to look like Italian cool kids, and the Italian cool kids must have worn them because they want, So it's weird. Where does the meaning derive from, do you think?
Well, I don't. I think it's this weird conversation that culture has with itself that no one is in charge of. So no one's policing this. No one's saying that this actually means this, which is why the meaning of words mutate, and they can mutate in ways. They can mutate so fast that people, can find terminology, even if they're 10 years out of date, completely bemusing. I mean, I'm getting to the point where I have no idea what some people are saying on Twitter. I just don't understand what the terminology is.
I read these things in the Times, and it's aimed at really old people in the Times, and it's explaining, here's what teenagers say nowadays. And it's what teenagers were probably saying 10 years ago. But it's these glossaries.
We were those teenagers, and we were turning up our noses at the articles that were written then about what we were saying, getting it all wrong. So, no, but I think that language is all about... Language, on the one hand, is about communicating, but it's also about tribalism. It's also about having your own slang that only you and your gang know. And so if you're wearing the T-shirt, if you're using a certain phrase, you're the in-group. You're part of the cool kids, and we're not those kids over there. They have their different hairstyles and different T-shirt slogans and different ways of doing things. So it's a language. It's an extensive language that I think everyone understands, even if they haven't spent much time analyzing it or thinking about it. I mean, every kid knows this. Every kid speaks this really broad language of sign, symbol, color, shape, accent, you name it. All of this stuff. It's almost, you almost get to the point where there's almost nothing that doesn't mean something.
Exactly, including nothing means so much. That's zero means so much. So there is nothing that doesn't mean something.
Yeah.
But so I mean, but bringing it back so was science fiction inevitable to be able to talk about these kind of ideas? Was it the only way to talk about it? Because I mean, as I said to you before, Ryan, it's like, although there is a classic science fiction story embedded in this, for me, the main story, it's genre breaking. It incorporates so many different things, and it even incorporates not only the typography, the way that you've worked with that, but there are so many different ways of telling stories in there. You tell stories through the means of reports, you tell them through audio files, you're telling them through billboards. There's so many different ways of how we impart information, how we communicate, and how the mode of communication changes. The difference between a NASA report and it's just someone talking in the streets and talking in a pub and trying to explain a story to their friends, and all of that's there as well. So kind of a thousand questions there, but was science fiction the best way to do something of this scope and to frame it and to give it
Yeah.
a kind of backbone?
I mean, I grew up reading that kind of expansive science fiction. I mean, I would the earliest science fiction stories that really sort of impressed me were Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Rendezvous with Rama. And what they both have in common is this idea of this kind of opening up to a wider universe. I think this is probably Arthur C. Clarke's major theme. I mean, it happens in Childhood's End as well. So it's this idea that we've stepped out onto a much bigger stage, and how do we deal with that? You know, it's not only transformative in terms of what is happening out there in the universe, it's transformative in terms of what it does to us as human beings, because we have to look at what we are. And that's one of Arthur C. Clarke's major themes. And again, without any spoilers, that's what I tried to do at the end of the novel, was sort of push that as far as I possibly could. I mean, one thing that both 2001 and Rendezvous with Rama do is they kind of end on cliffhangers. In fact, this is why there's 3 or 4 sequels of varying quality that have been written after the fact. But what I wanted to do was take this transformative, almost transcendental idea and just push it as far as I can. So if the D-Men and if our sort of ideas that epitomize us are encoded in our culture, and if maybe that culture is what survives us, you know, we come and go as sort of individuals, but you know, the ideas that we create and articulate through our characters, whether that be Superman or anybody else or the D-Men, maybe these are what survive us, but not only survive us in the short term. These are what conquer the universe. These are what remain of us after human beings probably no longer exist. And in what form might our D-Men survive us, you know, into the far distant future and evolution of the universe? So inevitably,
I won't blow any of the ending, but the way you do condense that into, I mean, this idea is pushed to the cosmic limits. You know, the book kind of goes everywhere. It's like Stapleton's Star Maker or something, where it just doesn't stop expanding. But at the same time, the whole concept is condensed into something really familiar and kind of brilliant at the end when we find out, you know, exactly what that signal might sound like. So, you know, and people can read that for themselves, but that's what I love about it. It was brought back to, from the cosmic limits, there was this human thing that when you understand what the sound is, it brings it all right back. So yeah, that was that expanse and that scale, but containing it in something really familiar at the end was great.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, one of the other things that I tried to do was, I mean, it's very easy to sort of regurgitate certain tropes that you were very impressed with early on. But so I think what you've got to do is you've got to sort of boil it down to the essence and figure out precisely what it was that you liked. So you don't take superficial aspects, you take you know, the core ideas. And so the book is about semiotics and consciousness and culture and ideas, but then it rides along on a science fiction story, or bits of it are. You know, a lot of it takes place on Earth, so it's not just a science fictional story, but it has.
It's a story about an Ealing design studio as well, which I love, which is obviously close to your heart.
Yeah, I get a few.
And about the people who work there and live there and suddenly are drawn into something bigger. So yeah, I mean, to me, like I said, it's genre breaking in the sense that it's also about those things, but it goes out to the limits of imagination and the limits of the universe. But it's about a signal, and as I say, when we kind of find out what the signal sounds like, it's really a nice condensation of all that.
I think Nick's popped in to tell us that we're running out.
He has, hasn't
it? Speaking of signals, well, actually, I wanted to ask if you wanted to. We've got plenty of questions from the audience. If you wanted to take a couple of those before we adjourn for the night. Seems like a good
Yeah, we'll
opportunity.
do a couple of questions, sure.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to pick a few, or where are the questions? Ask a question.
If you would like to look at them, they're in the Ask a Question function at the bottom, but I was just going to volunteer and pick some.
Yeah, you just read out some questions.
Yeah. Would you like me to keep sharing the screen, Ryan, or can we?
Sharing the screen with us? No.
What I mean is the PowerPoint.
You can share the stage.
Okay, I'll just keep it up. Let's see. This one is from, and by the way, folks watching at home, I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name in advance. What makes you two gravitate towards one another's work? That's from Frank Gidalewski from Facebook.
For me, it's always been Ryan's style and intelligence, and both in equal measure. You know, and he's just a friend that I can talk to for hours and hours and hours and end without stopping, and we have proven that in the past. So that, you know, and just the beauty of the work, which I love from the first time I saw it in the Science Service.
Oh, thank you. Now, I think for Grant, it's that sort of planet-sized intelligence where it's not just about the story; it's about the structure and the mechanics of storytelling. And I think that as a graphic designer, you are so aware of the mechanics of communication, so it feeds right into my interests. I mean, Grant's work parallels the stuff that I'm interested in so many ways. So yeah, but he's right. We can sort of like go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, clear out an entire.
And we've actually done loads of work together. You know, I look back and it's like we've done a lot of stuff. But I think there's still the potential to do something new, which would be great. You know?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Let's do it, Grant. Let's do it. Something mind-bogglingly unusual and new and fresh and bizarre.
It has to be. Can only be.
Yeah.
It's good to have a fellow artist that you can mutually admire and collaborate with. That's awesome. This one is specifically for Ryan. What's your favorite storytelling technique that you can do in novels / prose that you can't, or at least can't do as well in comics?
Well, this is my first novel, so I'm kind of learning as I go here, and I think that I probably structure novels as I would a sort of film script or a comic strip, in that I sort of there's lots of very small chapters, and each one does a specific thing. So I broke it down into these tiny units and then sort of built it up out of units. So that is kind of comic strip in a way. It's almost like thinking of each sort of page of comics, and in a page you tend to, in a modern comic, only have a change of scene at the bottom of a page. So you rarely, older comics used to change scene 3 or 4 times in a page, but that happens less these days. So I think a lot of the kind of structural stuff is common to both of these forms. I think you can talk more about people's internal musings more easily than you can in comics, because you have the omniscient narrator and you can talk in the characters' internal voices, whereas in comic strips the thought bubble has almost entirely vanished, which I kind of get why it has, because people don't think in sentences and it seems a bit bizarre. But I really liked, if you look back at, say, sort of early Alan Moore stuff, there is an enormous amount of material in captions. So you have sort of Alan as the omniscient narrator telling you the story, whereas which I think is part of the power of it, because he's not just repeating what the pictures are telling you, he's giving you extra layers and more information. And I think a lot of comics, because it's just dialogue and pictures, you know, if there are captions, they tend not to be very extensive. I think we're kind of missing a trick there, and I do like that sort of authorial voice when it comes through that a lot of comics don't have.
Great. That's a really good answer, and an excellent point about being able to extrapolate upon characters like inner worlds more so than like the cinematic form of comics. Here's one. What comics are underrated in terms of how they emphasize design as part of the story? And this is for both of you.
Off you go.
Oh, well, you take that one, right? Mr. X is the only one I can think of that really emphasised design. But you know, like Chris Ware stuff obviously emphasised design, but I don't think he's underrated. I think
no, Chris yeah,
well rated and deservedly so.
No, absolutely. I mean, Chris Ware, again, sort of absolute genius of the form, sort of taking, driving the narrative up and down and across and through, and telling these very sort of intimate and human stories on the one hand, but using this very experimental form. I think that it's the marriage of character and the internal life of your characters, and the sort of more experimental form. I think that's a good sort of marriage. You don't want both things to be so experimental that you have no way into the story. You could maybe have really experimental characters told in a very straightforward way, or have quite normal characters told in a very experimental way. But maybe you just need some familiarity to let the reader sort of in on that. Other than that, I'm not sure what else have I read recently that I liked. I liked Adrian Tomein's recent one. I mean, that was a very straightforward autobiographical strip. There wasn't formally a lot of experiment going on there, but it was beautifully done.
Great answers. Yeah, Chris Ware is nuts. Like on a technical level, just amazing stuff. I always thought he worked in Illustrator, and then when I found out that no, it is by hand, it just blew my mind.
I think he scans it in.
The old skills.
Yeah, I mean, like the inking by hand, and then the color looks digital, but just like the penmanship is out of this world. Technique-wise.
It is incredible.
Yeah. Ryan, Grant mentioned a few months ago that they're working on a novel. Having just released your first one, do you have any tips?
Sorry, say that again. Do I have any?
Do you have any tips on writing a novel, seeing as how you just released your first one?
It's been a massive learning process. I mean, Grant would probably be able to tell you much more about the process of writing. I mean, very quickly, what I did was, because I'm a graphic designer, I started with the first thing I did was decide how big it was going to be, what the page size was, and then I opened a design document and I started writing in the font on the page. So it was in its final, well, not final form, but very close to its final form as I wrote it. So it never existed as a typewritten manuscript in double-spaced courier. But I don't know whether I'd recommend that to everyone. I mean, one of the good things about writing in InDesign was that I could shuffle the elements around. So I would write each chapter, and each piece could then be interspersed and moved around. So there was a high degree of flexibility right up to the 11th hour, which I found really helpful, because that's the way I build a piece of design or an illustration, is that right up towards the end of doing an illustration, I'm still making major structural changes to it. Whereas, I mean, do you work like that, Grant? I mean, do you?
Well, yeah, I'm sort of halfway through this novel right now that I'm supposed to have finished by the start of next year.
Oh, right.
But I plan everything, and that's what I've wondered what you do. I spoke to Neil Gaiman, and Neil Gaiman kind of just writes. He likes to just find his way in, and the characters will take him on a journey. I have to have the entire thing planned out. And this book is based on the golden section, the spiral. So all the chapters have to be, it's 10 chapters, and it has to have 5,000 words each. And it's like that. Everything has to be worked out. The characters barely have room to move with me, and it's just once I start writing, and then once I've got them in the structure, but every chapter title's worked out. Everything is kind of done as a plan before I even start. And I wondered how that compared to your approach. It's very visual for me. I'm working out what what is the shape of this, and how do I divide it?
That's exactly how I do things. It's about the overall shape that the thing makes. The way sort of elements of it reflect other elements of it. It's a very structured thing. But do you find, I mean, all of the characters in XX are there because they serve a very specific narrative purpose. And I was pretty much, I don't know, 75% of the way through the book before and a couple of them still had placeholder names that sort of, and the names were what their function was rather than who they were. So.
Right.
Do you find that you have to watch out that your characters don't just become placeholders, and you have to sort of humanize them in a way? Do you get to the point where they come to life? Because that's what I found. I mean, this was all new to me, but when I got to the end, I could then go back and sort of fix. And they were all throughout because I didn't write it from beginning to end. I went back to the earlier sections and I could hear the characters talk by this point because they'd come to life in my head. But I'd had to sort of live with them sort of a more protean way before they'd actually coalesced completely. And then I could go back and bring a bit more life to them. Is that how it works for you?
Well, it's kind of they spring fully formed, most of them. But it's more like they become trapped in the infernal machinery of the story. You know, they usually come to me very vividly, as with names, like full names and entire histories and what they're into. And I can get carried away just talking about them and doing dialogue for them, and have to prune it back generally. But they flower up quite naturally. But like I say, they end up trapped in these ghastly structures that I've created around them.
What happens if they want to do something that doesn't serve the plot? Do you have to sort of steer them?
No, I would let it play out, and I would usually figure out later that it did serve the plot, because there are points where you have to just let go and trust that your own understanding of the structure is also driving what seems to be unconscious decisions.
Well, that's what interests me, is that I think there's a kind of structural level that you set out, and that's kind of like your guardrail. And then there's a level below that where there's room for play. And sometimes the stuff that occurs to you where you're just sort of following your nose ends up relating to the structural level in ways that you'd never have thought of otherwise. I mean, this is all, again, sort of new to me, but it's the interplay of working things out, but then allowing yourself room for serendipity to
I always to have better ideas, because better ideas do come when you become really immersed in the work.
Yeah. How long does it take you to sort of dive into the point where you're utterly immersed? I mean, does it take a while, or can you just dip in and
like 3 hours of messing about and reading books and reading other things I've written to remind myself I can still do it. So it takes about 3 hours, and then the flow state gets in and you kind of can't get away from it. So I don't know if that's how you.
No, that's what I found. And then what happens is that it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I've not eaten any dinner and I can feel my eyes closing. But...
Well, that sounds like a good place to stop. Ryan, Grant, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation, especially so late at night where you guys are. Really, thank you for making that sacrifice. And
yeah, you can see the black and starless sky behind me.
Yes.
No, thanks for inviting me in again. That was fun, Ryan, as ever.
Yeah, no, thank you, Grant. I know it is late, so way past your bedtime. So again, much appreciated.
Yeah, it just meant it was a little bit more mellow, didn't it?
Yeah. We did it without alcohol this time as well. But
exactly, I'm proud of us. Very proud of us.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Is this going to be?
Thank you, and also make sure you check out Ryan's book, because it is one of the greatest books of our century so far. Seriously, like no hyperbole.
Speaking of, I went ahead and pasted a link to purchase Ryan's book as well. There is a green button at the bottom of the screen. Very obvious. You can click that. But I believe, Ryan, you had some words.
I think you have signed copies. I did some book plates, so you get a fancy Strand Books signed copy if you order. Is there anything else they need to know? Thank you for coming. Hope we weren't too up our own arses.
Thank you to Ryan.
That's where we belong.
Thank you to everyone else for bearing with me on the PowerPoint tech. Yes, and having patience. But one last thing to note, for folks who would like to watch this again or who perhaps missed a little bit of it, there will be an entire recording of this whole event online through Crowdcast. Just use the same link and the same password. As soon as we're done, you can immediately go and watch it again.
Okay.
And if you're on Facebook, the recording will live on
Again
Facebook.
and again and again.
Again.
And maybe we'll make sense.
Yeah.
Eventually.
With that, you gentlemen go have some supper or get some rest, or both.
All right, thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a good night.
Cool. Bye.
Take care.
Good night.